The dust cloud behind the old Chevy pickup truck had barely settled when Marlena Davies stepped out into the scorching Texas heat. Her left leg buckled slightly as her worn boot hit the gravel, but she steadied herself against the truck's door, jaw set with determination. The Triple Star Ranch stretched endlessly before her, a sea of golden grass broken only by weathered fence posts and the occasional mesquite tree. She'd driven 8 hours straight from Oklahoma City with nothing but $17 in her pocket, a duffel bag of clothes, and a newspaper clipping advertising ranch work. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What she didn't know was that in exactly 47 minutes, she'd reject the kindness of a stranger so firmly that he'd question everything he thought he knew about helping people. And what neither of them could have imagined was that a simple piece of jewelry would change both their lives forever. Marlena had been walking with a limp for 3 years, ever since the accident at the oil rig where she'd worked alongside her father. The doctors in Tulsa had done what they could, but when the insurance ran out and the bills kept coming, she'd learned to live with the constant ache in her left hip. Physical therapy was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when choosing between healing and eating meant choosing between healing and surviving. The ranch house sat about a quarter mile from the main road, a sprawling one-story structure with a wraparound porch that had seen better decades. Paint peeled from its wooden siding like sunburned skin, and several windows were patched with cardboard and duct tape. But the roof looked solid, and smoke curled from a chimney despite the August heat, suggesting someone was home. She grabbed her duffel bag and started the long walk up the dirt drive, her limp becoming more pronounced with each step. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat began to bead on her forehead despite the early morning hour. Cattle dotted the pastures on either side of the drive, their heads lifting curiously as she passed. Most were Herefords, she noted, though a few Angus mixed in with the herd. Growing up on her grandfather's small farm in eastern Oklahoma, she'd learned to read livestock like other people read books. The screen door of the ranch house creaked, open before she'd made it halfway up the drive. A man emerged, tall and lean, with silver threading through his dark hair. He wore faded Wrangler jeans and a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Even from a distance, she could see the way he carried himself, confident but not arrogant, the kind of man who'd earned his place in the world through sweat and determination rather than luck or inheritance. "You lost, miss," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. Marlena straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to walk more evenly despite the shooting pain in her hip. "I'm looking for Jackson Whitmore. I'm here about the job posting." The man stepped off the porch, and she could see his face more clearly now. Weather-beaten and honest, with kind eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. There was something familiar about his features, though she was certain they'd never met. "That'd be me," he said, extending a calloused hand as she finally reached the yard. "Jack Whitmore. Though most folks just call me Whitmore." She shifted her duffel bag to her left hand and shook his hand firmly. "Marlena Davies. I drove down from Oklahoma City." His grip was strong but not crushing, and she noticed he didn't comment on her limp or the way she'd favored her right leg during the walk up the drive. Points in his favor, she thought. She'd grown tired of the pitying looks and unsolicited advice about doctors she couldn't afford to see. "Long drive," Whitmore observed. "Have you had breakfast yet?" "I'm fine," she replied automatically. The truth was, she'd eaten half a gas station sandwich 12 hours ago, and her stomach was gnawing at itself. But accepting food felt too much like accepting charity. "I'd rather just talk about the work if that's all right." Something shifted in his expression, not disappointment exactly, but recognition, like he'd seen that particular kind of pride before. "Coffee then?" he asked. "I was just making a pot anyway." She almost refused again, but coffee wasn't a meal, and the caffeine might help her focus despite her exhaustion. Coffee would be good. The inside of the ranch house surprised her. While the exterior showed years of deferred maintenance, the interior was clean and well organized. The living room held comfortable-looking furniture arranged around a stone fireplace, and she could see a kitchen through an archway where morning light streamed through gingham curtains. It felt like a home rather than a bachelor pad, though she didn't see any signs of a wife or family. Whitmore led her to the kitchen, where he poured 2 mugs of coffee from a percolator on the stove. The coffee was strong and black, the kind that could wake the dead, and she drank it gratefully while he settled across from her at a worn wooden table. So he said, "What kind of ranch work have you done before?" "I grew up on my grandfather's place outside Muskogee," she said. 160 acres, mostly cattle with some horses. Helped with everything: feeding, vaccinations, birthing, fence repair. Worked there summers through high school and college. College? Agricultural science at OSU. I graduated 3 years ago. She didn't mention that she'd had to drop out twice when her father got injured and money got tight, or that it had taken her 6 years to finish a 4-year degree. What brought you to Texas? This was always the tricky part. How much truth was too much? How little was dishonest? "Work dried up in Oklahoma," she said finally. "Oil industry's been rough, and that affects everything else. Figured I'd try somewhere new." It wasn't exactly a lie. The oil industry had been brutal, especially after her father's accident. But it wasn't the whole truth either. She didn't mention the repo man who'd taken their truck, or the eviction notice that had sent her packing, or the fact that she'd chosen Texas partly because it was far enough away that her father's former co-workers wouldn't look at her with that mixture of pity and guilt that had become so familiar. Whitmore nodded slowly. "This isn't easy work, especially in this heat. I run about 800 head on 4,000 acres. It's just me and 2 other hands, Miguel Santos and his son Carlos. Miguel's been with me for 15 years, and Carlos since he was old. Enough to sit a horse properly." "What happened to your other help?" "Nothing dramatic. Old Pete retired last month, moved to Corpus Christi to be near his daughter. I've been trying to manage with just Miguel and Carlos, but we're heading into fall roundup, and I need someone who knows cattle." She leaned forward slightly. "What would my responsibilities be?" "Bit of everything. Checking fence lines, moving cattle between pastures, helping with medical care when needed. Some nights you might be out checking on expectant mothers. Pay is $400 a week plus room and board. The bunkhouse isn't fancy, but it's clean and private. $400 a week was more than she'd made at her last job, and room and board meant she wouldn't have to worry about rent or groceries. It sounded almost too good to be true. "When would you need me to start?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing. I know it's quick, but like I said, we're coming up on busy season." She set down her coffee mug, studying his face. He seemed honest enough, but she'd learned to be cautious about situations that seemed too perfect. "Can I see the bunkhouse?" "Course." He led her back outside and around behind the main house, where a smaller building sat beneath a cluster of oak trees. The bunkhouse was simple but solid. 2 rooms with a shared bathroom, basic furniture, and windows that actually had glass in them. It was cleaner than the last 3 places she'd rented combined. "Miguel and Carlos live in town with Miguel's wife," Whitmore explained. "So you'd have this place to yourself most of the time." She walked through both rooms, checking the water pressure in the bathroom sink and testing the firmness of the mattress. Everything seemed functional, if not luxurious. "Looks good," she said finally. They walked back toward the main house, passing a large barn and several smaller outbuildings. The property was bigger than she'd expected, and she could see cattle scattered across multiple pastures in the distance. "I should tell you," she said, stopping near her truck. "I've got a bum leg. Old injury. Doesn't usually affect my work, but I wanted you to know." Whitmore glanced at her left leg, then back at her face. "Can you ride?" "Yes, sir. Better than I can walk, actually. That's what matters out here. Most of the work's done on horseback anyway." Relief flooded through her. She'd worried that her limp would disqualify her from ranch work, but if riding was the main requirement, she could handle that. "So," Whitmore said, "you want the job?" She should have felt excited, but instead, a familiar wariness crept in. In her experience, when things seemed too easy, there was usually a catch. "What's the real story?" she asked. "Why hire someone you just met? Don't you want references?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Besides, I'm a pretty good judge of character. You drove 8 hours on maybe, cattle, and you're not afraid of hard work. That's enough for me." The comment about reminding him of someone made her curious, but she didn't push. Everyone had their ghosts. "All right then," she said. "I accept." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They shook hands again, and this time she noticed the slight tremor in his fingers that he tried to hide. She filed the observation away, wondering what other secrets the Triple Star Ranch might be keeping. "I'll get my things settled and be ready to start first thing tomorrow," she said. "Take your time getting situated. Miguel and Carlos usually show up around 6, but we can start you off easy the first few days while you get the lay of the land." She nodded and headed back to her truck for her duffel bag. As she pulled it from the passenger seat, she caught sight of herself in the side mirror. Dusty, tired, and probably foolish for taking the job from a complete stranger. But it was better than the alternative she'd been facing. And something about Jackson Whitmore seemed trustworthy. The afternoon passed quietly as she unpacked her few belongings and explored the immediate area around the bunkhouse. The building was more comfortable than anywhere she'd lived in years, with a small kitchenette and even a television that picked up 3 fuzzy channels. Best of all, it was hers. No roommates, no landlords demanding rent she couldn't pay. No neighbors complaining about every little noise. As evening approached, she found herself sitting on the small porch outside the bunkhouse, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The Texas sky painted itself in shades of orange and pink that seemed too vivid to be real, and the air finally began to cool as shadows lengthened. Across the pastures, she was contemplating whether to drive into town for supplies when she saw Whitmore approaching from the direction of the main house. He carried a plate covered with a dish towel, and her stomach clenched with both hunger and embarrassment. "Figured you might be hungry," he said, offering her the plate. "Made too much. Chilly anyway." The smell that escaped when she lifted the towel made her mouth water, but she forced herself to hand the plate back. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm fine. I was planning to drive into town for groceries anyway. It's just chilly, Marlena." "Nothing fancy." And I said I'm fine. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but accepting his food felt like admitting she couldn't take care of herself. She'd made that mistake before, letting people help until help became dependence, and dependence became a cage. Whitmore studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Suit yourself. But if you change your mind, there's plenty left." After he'd gone back to the house, she sat in the gathering darkness, listening to her stomach growl and questioning her decision. Pride was a cold companion, but it was better than owing someone something she couldn't repay. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, and she wasn't eager to repeat the experience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight she was exactly where she needed to be. Independent, employed, and answerable to no one but herself. It was enough. It had to be. Dawn broke over the Triple Star Ranch with the kind of silence that only exists in wide-open spaces. Marlena had been awake for an hour, nursing her second cup of instant coffee and watching the sky lighten from deep purple to pale gold. Her hip ached worse in the mornings, especially after sleeping on an unfamiliar mattress, but she'd learned to work through the stiffness. At 5:58, she heard the rumble of an approaching truck. Through her window, she watched a dusty Ford pickup pull up near the barn, followed by the sound of voices speaking rapid Spanish. Miguel and Carlos Santos, she assumed. Time to make her first impression count. She grabbed her worn cowboy hat and headed outside, her limp barely noticeable after the morning's movement had loosened her joints. The father and son were already unloading equipment from their truck, coiled ropes, veterinary supplies, and what looked like branding irons wrapped in canvas. "Buenos dias," she called out as she approached. The older man turned, revealing a weathered face dominated by kind eyes and a graying mustache. He was shorter than she'd expected, but built like someone who'd spent decades doing physical labor. "You must be Marlena," he said in lightly accented English. "Miguel Santos. This is my son Carlos." Carlos looked to be in his early 20s, with his father's build, but none of the weathering that came with age. He nodded politely, but seemed more interested in studying her boots and the way she moved than making conversation. "Whitmore says you know cattle," Miguel continued. "Some," she replied. "Grew up around them in Oklahoma. Different cattle in Texas. Meaner heat, longer distances, you'll see." Before she could respond, Whitmore emerged from the main house carrying a thermos and what looked like a lunch pail. He wore the same style of clothes as yesterday, but looked more alert, like morning was his natural element. "Everyone met?" he asked, joining their small circle near the barn. "Just getting acquainted," Miguel said. "What's the plan for today?" "Thought we'd start Marlena easily. Check the north pasture fence line, see how she handles Buttercup." Carlos snorted with barely suppressed laughter. "Buttercup?" "My most patient Mare," Whitmore explained to Marlena. "If you can't handle her, you probably shouldn't be working cattle." "Fair enough," she said, though the name made her wonder what she was getting herself into. They headed into the barn, where the smell of hay and leather created an atmosphere that felt like home to Marlena. 8 stalls lined the central aisle, though only 6 held horses. Whitmore led her to a stall containing a stocky pink mare with intelligent eyes and a star-shaped marking on her forehead. "This is Buttercup," he said, opening the stall door. 16 years old, steady as a rock, and smarter than most people I know. The mare stepped forward to investigate Marlena, who extended her hand palm up for inspection. Buttercup sniffed delicately, then allowed herself to be petted. "She's beautiful," Marlena said, running her fingers along the mare's neck. "Paint horses are my favorite." "Mine too. My mother always said they were the most honest horses. No pretense, no hiding what they were." Marlena caught the past tense reference to his mother, but didn't comment. Everyone had losses they carried. Whitmore showed her where the tack was stored, and she selected a well-worn saddle that looked like it would fit both her and Buttercup comfortably. As she lifted it from its rack, he stepped forward as if to help, then caught himself when she shot him a warning look. "I've got it," she said firmly. "Never doubted you did." Saddling Buttercup felt like slipping into a familiar rhythm. The mare stood patiently while Marlena adjusted stirrups and checked the cinch, occasionally turning her head to watch the proceedings with what looked like approval. Miguel and Carlos had saddled their own horses, matching sorrels that moved with the efficiency of long practice. Whitmore chose a tall bay gelding that seemed to mirror its owner's quiet confidence. "North pasture fence runs about 12 miles, Whitmore explained as they led their horses outside. "We'll ride it slowly, looking for breaks or weak spots. Cattle have been testing it lately, and I'd rather fix problems before we lose half the herd." Mounting Buttercup required a moment of calculation. Marlena's left leg didn't have the strength it once did, and she needed to compensate without making her limitation obvious. She positioned the mare near a mounting block that sat beside the barn, using it to gain the extra height she needed. The moment she settled into the saddle, something inside her relaxed for the first time in months. Buttercup responded to the lightest pressure from her legs, turning and stopping with the kind of partnership that only came from a truly well-trained horse. "How does she feel?" Whitmore asked. Like coming home, Marlena answered honestly. They rode out in single file, with Miguel leading and Marlena bringing up the rear. The morning air was already warm, but a slight breeze from the south made it bearable. Cattle lifted their heads as the riders passed, some following along the fence line with the curiosity common to Herefords. The fence itself was a mixture of old and new, some sections clearly original to the ranch, others obviously recent repairs. Most of it looked solid, but Marlena noticed several spots where the wire sagged or posts leaned at concerning angles. "There," she called out, pointing to a section where the bottom wire had snapped completely. "Looks fresh." Whitmore rode over to examine the break. "Good eye. Probably happened yesterday or the day before." Miguel dismounted and pulled wire cutters from his saddlebag. "I'll splice it temporarily, fix it properly later." As Miguel worked, Carlos rode closer to Marlena. "You really grew up on a ranch?" "Farm. Mostly. My grandfather raised cattle, but nothing like this scale." "What happened to your leg?" "Carlos," Miguel said sharply without looking up from his work. "It's all right," Marlena said. "An accident at work a few years back, nothing dramatic." Carlos nodded but didn't pursue it further. She appreciated that he'd asked directly rather than pretending not to notice, but she also appreciated that he didn't push when she kept her answer vague. They continued along the fence line, stopping twice more for minor repairs. By the time they'd covered half the distance, the sun was beating down with the kind of intensity that made Marlena grateful for her hat and long sleeves. Buttercup plodded steadily along, occasionally stopping to snatch a mouthful of grass, but never requiring correction. "Water break," Whitmore announced, dismounting near a stock tank that sat in the shade of a massive oak tree. The horses gathered around the tank while the humans found spots in the shade. Whitmore produced bottles of water from his saddlebags and passed them around, and this time Marlena accepted gratefully. Refusing water in this heat would have been stupid rather than proud. "So what do you think of Texas so far?" Miguel asked. "Hot," she said, which earned chuckles from both Santa's men. "Wait until August," Carlos said. "This is nothing." "It's July," Marlena pointed out. "Early July," Whitmore corrected. "Trust me, it gets worse before it gets better." They remounted and continued their circuit, the conversation flowing more easily now. Miguel told stories about cattle he'd known over the years, each one more outrageous than the last. Carlos contributed observations about local wildlife, pointing out hawk nests and explaining the territorial habits of the ranch's resident roadrunner. Whitmore mostly listened, occasionally adding details or corrections, but Marlena noticed he kept glancing at her as if gauging her reactions. Not in a suspicious way, but like he was trying to figure something out. The final section of fence ran along a creek bed that was mostly dry except for a few stagnant pools. The vegetation was thicker here, providing more shade but also concealing potential problems. "This part's always trouble," Miguel muttered, dismounting to push through a tangle of mesquite branches. "Cattle like to rub against the posts, and the wet ground makes everything unstable." Sure enough, they found 3 posts that had worked. Loosen the soft soil, allowing the fence to sag dangerously. It would take more than temporary repairs to fix this section properly. "We'll need to come back with the post hole digger," Whitmore said. "Maybe tomorrow, after the ground dries out a bit more." "I could start on it this afternoon," Marlena offered. "If you've got the tools." "That's not necessary. This is your first day." "I'm not afraid of hard work. I know you're not. But there's no rush." Something in his tone suggested this was about more than just fence repair. But she didn't push. She was still figuring out the dynamics of this place and these people. The ride back to the barn passed quietly, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Marlena found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, noting the locations of gates and water sources, the natural gathering spots where cattle like to congregate. This wasn't just a job to her, it was a chance to belong somewhere again. To have a purpose beyond simple survival. Back at the barn, They unsaddled their horses and turned them out into a paddock behind the building. Buttercup followed Marlena to the gate, nickering softly when she scratched behind the mare's ears. "She likes you," Whitmore observed. "The feeling's mutual. She's got good manners and a gentle mouth. Someone spent time training her properly. My mother did, actually. Buttercup was her favorite." Again, the reference to his mother in past tense. Marlena wanted to ask but held back. She'd only been here 24 hours, too. Soon for personal questions. Miguel and Carlos were loading their truck with the tools they'd need for afternoon projects. "We're heading to the south pasture to check on those new calves," Miguel told Whitmore. "Want Marlena to come along?" "Actually," Whitmore said, "I thought she might help me with some paperwork this afternoon. Get familiar with our record-keeping system." Marlena's stomach tightened. Paperwork usually meant sitting still for extended periods, which was when her hip bothered her most. But she nodded agreement. The Santos men drove off in a cloud of dust, leaving Marlena alone with Whitmore for the first time since yesterday morning. The silence stretched between them as they walked toward the house. Not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with unspoken questions. "Coffee?" he asked as they reached the porch. "Please." Inside, the house felt cooler thanks to thick walls and strategic window placement. Whitmore gestured toward the kitchen table while he started a fresh pot of coffee. "Records are pretty straightforward," he said, pulling a ledger from a drawer. "Births, deaths, medical treatments, feed purchases. Miguel keeps track of most of it, but I like to review everything monthly." Marlena opened the ledger and found neat columns of information recorded in Miguel's careful handwriting. Birth dates, dam and sire information, vaccination schedules. It was more detailed than anything her grandfather had ever maintained. "This is impressive," she said. "Most small operations don't keep records this thorough. Learned the hard way that good records save money and heartache. Lost a whole calf crop to disease about 10 years ago because I didn't track vaccinations properly." The coffee finished brewing, and he poured 2 mugs. This time he added cream to his, she noticed, while she took hers black dot as they worked through the ledger entries. Marlena began to understand the scope of the operation. 800 head was a lot of cattle for 3 people to manage, especially spread across 4,000 acres. No wonder Whitmore had been eager to hire help. "What happened to Pete?" she asked. "The hand who retired. Nothing dramatic. He was 73 and talking about slowing down for years. His daughter in Corpus Christi had a baby last spring, and he decided he wanted to spend time with his granddaughter. Long time to work at one place. 26 years. Started the same week as Miguel, actually. They were good friends." Marlena could hear the fondness in his voice and wondered what it would be like to have that kind of stability, to know people well enough to consider them family. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Whitmore explaining his system, while she absorbed the information. The afternoon heat built steadily outside, but the house remained cool, and she found herself relaxing in spite of her usual wariness. "Can I ask you something?" Whitmore said eventually. She tensed slightly. "Depends what it is. Why are you really here? And don't say work dried up in Oklahoma. There's more to it than that." The directness of the question caught her off guard. She'd been expecting it eventually, but not quite so soon or so bluntly. "Does it matter?" she asked. "Probably not. But I'd like to know who I'm working with." She closed the ledger and leaned back in her chair, studying his face. He didn't look judgmental, just curious. And maybe lonely, though that could have been projection on her part. "My father got hurt on an oil rig 3 years ago," she said finally. "Same accident that messed up my leg. He couldn't work anymore, and the medical bills piled up faster than we could pay them. I tried to keep things together, but..." She shrugged. "Sometimes trying isn't enough. Where's your father now?" "Assisted living facility in Tulsa. Medicaid covers most of it, but he needed more care than I could provide." "That must have been hard. It was necessary." Whitmore nodded slowly. What about other family? Just me. My mother died when I was 12, and my grandfather passed away while I was in college. No siblings, no cousins worth mentioning. So you came to Texas to start over. Something like that. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee mug. When he looked up again, his expression had changed somehow, still kind, but with an edge of understanding that hadn't been there before. I know something about starting over, he said. This ranch belonged to my parents. I grew up here, but I left after high school. Spent 15 years in Dallas working construction. Swore I'd never come back to the middle of nowhere. What changed? Your mind? My mother got sick, cancer. My father couldn't handle the ranch and take care of her at the same time, so I came home to help. She died 6 months later. I'm sorry. It was 8 years ago. The grief isn't as sharp now, but some days I still expect to hear her voice calling from the kitchen. Marlena understood that feeling. Sometimes she still reached for the phone to call her grandfather when something interesting happened, forgetting for a moment that he was gone. What about your father? Heart attack 2 years after my mother died. I think he just couldn't stand being without her. So you ended up with the ranch. Lock, stock, and barrel. Some days I'm grateful for it. Other days I feel trapped by it. But it's home, I guess. They sat in silence again, but it felt different now. Heavier with shared understanding. Both of them knew what it meant to have your life upended by circumstances beyond your control, to find yourself in a place you'd never planned to be. The bunkhouse where you're staying, Whitmore said eventually, that was my parents' room originally. They built it when I was a teenager, said the main house was getting too small for 3 adults. My mother loved having her own space. Marlena felt a strange chill despite the afternoon heat. I can find somewhere else to stay if... No, he said quickly. She would have liked knowing someone was using it. She always said empty rooms made her sad. The conversation drifted to lighter topics after that. The quirks of individual cattle, the best routes between pastures, the personalities of the various ranch horses. But Marlena found herself studying Whitmore with new eyes, recognizing in him some of the same restlessness she'd been carrying for years. As evening approached, she excused herself to return to the bunkhouse. The day had been successful by any measure. She'd proven she could handle the work, gotten along well with Miguel and Carlos, and apparently passed whatever test Whitmore had been giving her. So why did she feel so unsettled? Maybe it was the personal conversation, which had revealed more about both of them than she'd intended to share. Or maybe it was the growing realization that the Triple Star Ranch might be exactly what she'd been looking for without knowing she was looking for anything at all that night. As she sat on the small porch outside her temporary home, she found herself thinking about Whitmore's mother and wondering what kind of woman she'd been. Someone who loved horses and valued her independence, apparently. Someone who understood that sometimes the most generous thing you could do was give people space to figure things out for themselves. The stars were clearer here than they'd ever been in Oklahoma, and she spent a long time looking up at them, trying to decide if feeling hopeful was wise or dangerous. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in years, she wasn't dreading what came next. 3 weeks into her employment at the Triple Star Ranch, Marlena had settled into a rhythm that felt more natural than anything she'd experienced. In years, her body had adapted to the long days in the saddle, and her hip bothered her less when she stayed active. Even better, she'd earned her first paycheck and felt the unfamiliar comfort of money in her pocket without the accompanying anxiety about how long it would last. The morning started like most others, with coffee before dawn and the sound of Miguel's truck arriving promptly at 6. But today carried a different energy. Storm clouds had been building since midnight, and the air felt electric with the promise of rain. Finally, Carlos said as they gathered in the barn. Haven't had decent rain in 6 weeks. Rain means mud, Miguel pointed out, and mud means problems. Whitmore emerged from the tack room carrying a coiled rope and a grim expression. Speaking of problems, We've got 3 head missing from the east pasture. Found a section of fence. Down near Miller's Creek. Marlena looked up from saddling Buttercup. Missing how? Strayed or stolen? Probably strayed, but with cattle prices what they are, I'm not taking chances. Miguel, you and Carlos check the creek bottom. Marlena and I will ride the property line, see if they wandered onto neighboring land. The division of labor surprised her. In 3 weeks, Whitmore had never paired them off alone for extended work. They developed an easy professional relationship, but there was always Miguel or Carlos present to diffuse any personal tension. They rode out as the first fat. Raindrops began to fall, Buttercup dancing slightly beneath her as thunder rumbled in the distance. The missing cattle were Herefords, a young bull and 2 bred cows worth several $1,000s if something had happened to them. How well do you know your neighbors? Marlena asked as they approached the eastern boundary. Well enough. The Brennans to the north are good people, having been here longer than my family. The Hendersons to the east ... double quotes, he paused. Let's just say we don't always see eye to eye. About what? Water rights mostly. Their well went dry 2 years ago, and they've been pushing to reroute the creek that runs through both properties. I'm not opposed to helping neighbors, but what they're proposing would hurt my cattle operation. They reached the downed fence section, where broken posts and tangled wire told the story of either a vehicle impact or deliberate sabotage. The damage was too extensive to be accidental. This wasn't weather, Marlena observed, dismounting to examine the scene more closely. No, it wasn't. She studied the tire tracks in the soft earth near the fence line. 2 vehicles, both trucks-based. On the wheelbase and tread patterns. One set of tracks led away toward Henderson property. You think they took your cattle? I think I need to have a conversation with Bob Henderson. The question is whether you want to come along or head back to the ranch. The rain was falling steadily now, and Marlena's practical side suggested returning to shelter. But something in Whitmore's tone told her this wasn't just about missing livestock. I'll come. Might be good to have a witness. They followed a dirt road that marked the property boundary, their horses splashing through puddles that grew larger with each passing minute. The Henderson place came into view after 20 minutes of riding, a newer ranch house, surrounded by metal outbuildings and equipment that looked expensive but underused. Bob Henderson emerged from his house before they'd reached the yard. A tall man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him came 2 younger men Marlena didn't recognize, both armed with the swagger of people looking for trouble. Jack Whitmore, Henderson called out. What brings you by on such a wet morning? Missing cattle, Bob. 3 heads last seen. Near our shared fence line. Someone destroyed it sometime yesterday. That's unfortunate. Have you checked with the sheriff? Thought I'd check with my neighbors first. Professional courtesy. Henderson's smile widened. Well, I haven't seen any stray cattle, but you're welcome to look around. Though I should mention, we've had some rustling problems ourselves lately. Might be an organized operation. Marlena studied the man's face, noting the way his eyes shifted when he spoke. She'd grown up around honest ranchers who looked you straight in the eye when they talked. Henderson wasn't one of them. Interesting, Whitmore said mildly. What did they take from you? Oh, nothing yet. But we've had strangers nosing around, asking questions about security. Makes a man cautious. One of the younger men stepped forward. Maybe you should be more careful about your own security, Whitmore. Lot of remote areas on your spread. Easy for things to go missing. The threat was barely veiled, and Marlena saw Whitmore's hands tighten on his reins. The situation was escalating quickly, and they were outnumbered 3-1. We should go, she said quietly. Before this gets worse. But as they turned to leave, she caught sight of movement in a pen behind Henderson's largest barn. 3 Hereford cattle, one sporting the distinctive white blaze that marked him as Whitmore's prize bull. Jack, she murmured, nodding toward the pen. He followed her gaze and his jaw tightened. That's my bull. Prove it, Henderson said. "Lot of Herefords look alike. That bull has a distinctive scar on his left shoulder from getting tangled in. Wire as a calf. Want me to point it out?" The standoff stretched taut as the rain continued to fall. Marlena found herself calculating distances and escape routes, wondering if Henderson's men were armed with more than attitude. "Tell you what," Henderson said finally. "Seems like an honest mistake. Cattle do wander, especially in weather like this. I'll have my boys drive those three head back to your property this afternoon." "Generous of you," Whitmore said dryly. "Neighborly, though I hope this doesn't happen again. Might be harder to sort out next time." Another threat delivered. With that same empty smile, Marlena was beginning to understand why Whitmore had been reluctant to discuss his neighbors. They rode away without further incident, but the tension didn't leave Whitmore's shoulders until they were well clear of Henderson property. The rain had intensified to a steady downpour, and both horses were eager to get back to the barn. "Does this happen often?" Marlena asked when they were out of earshot. "More lately. Henderson's been testing boundaries ever since his well went dry. I think he's hoping to pressure me into selling him water rights." "What will you do?" "Document everything. Take pictures if those cattle show up with fresh brands or missing ear tags. And probably call the sheriff, though Bob's got friends in the department." They rode in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Marlena was beginning to realize that ranch life involved more politics and conflict than she'd anticipated. In Oklahoma, neighbors might disagree about boundary lines or water usage, but outright cattle theft was rare. By the time they reached the barn, the storm had reached full intensity. Lightning cracked overhead as they hurried to unsaddle their horses and get them into dry stalls. Miguel and Carlos had returned earlier, reporting no sign of the missing cattle in the creek bottom. "Found them," Whitmore told Miguel grimly. "Henderson had them penned up, claimed it was an honest mistake." Miguel's expression darkened. "Bob Henderson doesn't make honest mistakes." "No, he doesn't. We need to be more careful about checking fence lines, especially along his boundary." They spent the rest of the morning in the barn, cleaning tack and organizing equipment while rain drummed on the metal roof. Marlena found the work soothing. There was something meditative about cleaning leather and oiling hinges while listening to the storm outside. Around noon, the rain let up enough for them to make a dash to the house for lunch. Miguel had brought homemade tamales from his wife, and they ate in comfortable companionship while discussing afternoon plans. "If this weather breaks, we should move the pregnant cows closer to the barn," Miguel suggested. "3 of them are due any day, and I'd rather not have them drop calves in standing water." "Good thinking," Whitmore agreed. "Carlos, you and your father handle that. Marlena and I will check on the hay situation." The hay barn was located about half a mile from the main buildings, accessible by a dirt road that was now more mud than anything else. They took Whitmore's truck, a 4-wheel drive beast that handled the conditions with relative ease. Inside the barn, towering stacks of hay bales reached nearly to the rafters. Marlena climbed up to check the top layers while Whitmore examined the foundation bales for signs of moisture damage. "How much do you go through in a winter?" She called down from her perch 15 feet above the floor. "Depends on the weather. Bad winter, we might feed hay for 4 months. Mild winter, maybe 6 weeks." She was making her way down the stack when her foot slipped on a loose bale. For a terrifying moment she fell freely, her bad leg unable to provide the quick correction she needed. She hit the ground hard, her hip taking the brunt of the impact. Pain shot through her like electricity, and for several seconds she couldn't breathe. When her vision cleared, Whitmore was kneeling beside her, his face pale with concern. "Don't move," he said. "Let me check for injuries." "I'm fine," she gasped, trying to sit up. But when she tried to put weight on her left leg, the pain nearly made her vomit. "You're not fine. That was a 12-foot fall." He helped her sit up slowly, his hands gentle but thorough as he checked for obvious injuries. Nothing seemed broken, but her hip felt like it was on fire. "Can you stand?" She tried, but her leg wouldn't support her weight. The old injury, aggravated by the fall, had effectively shut down her mobility. Without asking permission, Whitmore scooped her up in his arms and carried her to the truck. The gesture was so unexpected that she was too shocked to protest until he was already settling her into the passenger seat. "I can walk," she said weakly. "No, you can't. And there's no shame in accepting help when you need it." The drive back to the ranch house was a blur of pain and embarrassment. She'd been so careful for 3 weeks, proving she could do the job despite her limitations. Now in one careless moment, she'd undone all that progress. Whitmore helped her into the house and settled her on the living room couch, propping her leg up with pillows. The pain was beginning to ebb slightly, but she knew from experience that the real problems would start when the swelling set in. "I should probably go to the hospital," she said reluctantly. "Probably, but first, let me get you something for the pain." He disappeared into what she assumed was his bedroom, returning with a bottle of prescription medication and a glass of water. "These are strong," he warned. "Leftover from when I broke my collarbone last year." She wanted to refuse, accepting his medication felt too much like charity. But the pain was genuinely severe, and she couldn't afford an emergency room visit, even if she needed one. "Thank you," she said, swallowing 2 pills with the water. "I'm calling Dr. Martinez. She's the local physician, makes house calls for situations like this." "I can't afford. It's covered under the ranch's insurance policy. All employees are covered for work-related injuries." Marlena doubted that climbing hay bales qualified as covered work, but she was too exhausted and hurting to argue. The medication was beginning to take effect, making everything seem slightly unreal. Dr. Martinez arrived within the hour, a competent woman in her 50s who examined Marlena with the efficiency of someone accustomed to ranch injuries. After a thorough assessment, she pronounced nothing broken but recommended complete rest for at least 48 hours. "The old injury makes things more complicated," she explained to Whitmore while Marlena dozed on the couch. "Any trauma to that area is going to cause significant inflammation. She needs to stay off her feet completely until the swelling goes down. I'll make sure she follows orders." When Marlena woke later that afternoon, the house was quiet except for the sound of rain still pattering against the windows. She was covered with a soft quilt that smelled like lavender and something else she couldn't identify. Whitmore appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with soup and crackers. "Feeling better?" "Some. The pain medication helps." He set the tray on the coffee table within easy reach. "Dr. Martinez says you need to stay put for a couple of days. No arguments." "I can't afford to miss work." "You're not missing work. You're recovering from a work-related injury. There's a difference." The soup was homemade chicken noodle, rich and comforting in a way that reminded her of her grandfather's cooking. She ate slowly, aware that Whitmore was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This is good," she said. "My mother's recipe. I don't cook much, but I can manage soup. You don't have to take care of me. I know I don't have to. I want to." The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to explore. In her experience, people who wanted to take care of her usually wanted something in return. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the rain-soaked landscape. "My mother used to say that kindness wasn't charity if it came from the heart. That the difference between helping someone and insulting them was whether you saw them as an equal or a project. Which am I?" "An equal. Someone who's had some bad luck and deserves better." The medication was making her drowsy again, but she fought to stay alert. This conversation felt important, though she wasn't sure why. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time," she said. "I know. And you'll go back to taking care of yourself as soon as you're able. But right now let someone else carry the load for a while." As evening settled over the ranch, Marlena found herself in the strange position of being cared for, without conditions or expectations. Whitmore brought her dinner, adjusted her pillows when she got uncomfortable, and never once made her feel like a burden. It was terrifying how much she wanted to trust it. That night, she slept on the couch despite his offers to let her use the guest bedroom. Accepting his hospitality for a few hours was one thing. Sleeping in his house felt like crossing a line she wasn't ready to cross. But as she drifted off to sleep, listening to the rain and feeling safer than she had in years, she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there were some forms of help that didn't come with strings attached. 2 days of forced rest had left Marlena feeling restless and useless, despite the dramatic improvement in her hip. The swelling had gone down considerably, and she could walk short distances without significant pain. More importantly, the forced confinement in Whitmore's living room had given her too much time to think about things she'd rather avoid. She woke before dawn on her 3rd day of recovery, determined to prove she was ready to return to work. The house was quiet as she made her way carefully to the kitchen, where she started a pot of coffee and began rummaging through cabinets for breakfast ingredients. "You're supposed to be resting." Whitmore's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, hair mussed from sleep and wearing a faded t-shirt that had seen better years. It was the most casual she'd seen him, and something about his rumpled appearance made him seem more approachable. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "Besides, I figured the least I could do was make breakfast since you've been feeding me for 2 days. The least you could do is follow doctor's orders." Dr. Martinez said to rest, not to become an invalid. "I can scramble eggs without damaging myself further." He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the refrigerator. "Eggs are on the 2nd shelf. There's bacon in the freezer if you want it." They worked together in comfortable silence, Marlena handling the cooking while Whitmore set the table and poured coffee. It felt domestic in a way that should have made her uncomfortable, but instead created an odd sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since her grandfather's death. "Miguel called last night," Whitmore said as they sat down to eat. "Those 3 cattle Henderson returned all have fresh marks where their ear tags were removed and replaced." Marlena paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Can you prove they were altered?" "Maybe. Miguel took pictures, and the vet might be able to tell if the tag holes are recent. But proving Henderson was behind it is another matter." "What's his endgame? Steal a few cattle at a time until you're forced to sell?" "Something like that. Or maybe he's hoping I'll make a mistake trying to protect my property. Give him an excuse to escalate things." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. Through the kitchen window, they could see a sheriff's department cruiser pulling up near the front porch. "Speaking of escalation," Whitmore muttered, standing to answer the door. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and the demeanor of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. He accepted Whitmore's invitation to come inside, but declined the offer of coffee. "Got a complaint filed yesterday," Bradley said without preamble. "Bob Henderson says you came onto his property making threats and accusations. I went there looking for missing cattle, which I found in his pen. Henderson says those cattle wandered onto his land during the storm. Says he was planning to return them anyway." Marlena watched the exchange from her seat at the kitchen table, noting the way Bradley avoided making direct eye contact with Whitmore. Either the sheriff was uncomfortable with his mission, or he already knew more about the situation than he was letting on. "Tom," Whitmore said calmly, "someone deliberately cut my fence and drove those cattle off my property. There are tire tracks and tool marks to prove it. Henderson mentioned you brought along a witness." Bradley's gaze shifted to Marlena. "You the new hand?" "I am." "See any evidence of wrongdoing?" Marlena chose her words carefully. "I saw 3 Hereford cattle in Henderson's pen that matched the description of the missing animals, including a bull with a distinctive scar. Henderson says a lot of Herefords look alike. Not many have a crescent-shaped scar on their left shoulder." Bradley made a note in his pocket notebook. but his expression suggested he wasn't particularly interested in pursuing the matter. "Look, Jack," he said, "I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. You're good people, and I don't think you're lying. But I can't arrest Bob Henderson for having cattle in his pen, especially when he returned them voluntarily." "What? About the fence damage?" "Could have been kids, could have been someone looking to rustle cattle who got spooked. Could have been a lot of things." Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "So Henderson can steal my livestock and destroy my property, and as long as he returns what he took, there are no consequences? I'm saying I need more evidence before I can file charges. Document everything, take pictures, maybe install some security cameras along your property line." After Bradley left, Whitmore stood at the kitchen window staring out at his land with an expression that mixed frustration and resignation. "He's not going to help," Marlena observed. "Tom's a good man, but he's also elected. Henderson's got money and influence, and I'm just one rancher with a complaint. So what do? We watch our backs and hope Henderson gets careless." The rest of the morning passed quietly, with Marlena insisting on light duties despite Whitmore's protests. By noon, she was moving normally enough that he finally agreed to let her help with feeding the horses. They were in the barn when Miguel and Carlos arrived with news that made everyone's blood run cold. "Fence down again," Miguel reported grimly. "South pasture this time, near the highway. But this time they didn't just take cattle. What else?" Whitmore asked. "Shot one of the yearling steers, left it to die in the field." The senseless cruelty of the act hit Marlena like a physical blow. Stealing cattle was one thing. It was a crime motivated by greed. But killing an animal just to hurt someone required a different kind of malice. "Same section as before?" Whitmore asked. "No, completely different area. Like they wanted to show they could hit anywhere they wanted." Whitmore was already moving toward the tack room. "Saddle the horses. I want to see this myself." "Jack," Marlena said quietly, "maybe I should stay here. Your hip is fine, and I want all of us together. Safety in numbers." They rode out in grim silence, the earlier camaraderie replaced by the tension of knowing they were under attack. The damaged fence was even more extensive than the previous incident. Nearly 50 yards of wire cut and posts knocked down. The dead steer lay about 30 yards into the pasture, and Marlena had to look away from the sight. The animal had been shot in the head but not killed cleanly, suggesting either poor marksmanship or deliberate cruelty. "Professional job on the fence," Carlos observed, examining the cut wire. "Too clean for vandals." Miguel was studying tire tracks in the soft ground near the highway. 2 trucks again, maybe 3 this time, came in fast and left the same way. Whitmore pulled out his phone and took pictures of everything: the fence damage, the tire tracks, the dead animal. His face was set in hard lines, and Marlena could see the anger building behind his careful control. "This was a message," he said finally. "What kind of message?" she asked. "The kind that says he's done playing games." They spent the next 2 hours repairing the fence with materials loaded hastily in the truck. It was hot, dirty work made worse by the presence of the dead steer, which would have to be removed by the rendering company. As they worked, Marlena found herself constantly scanning the horizon for threats. The feeling of being watched was probably imagination, but it was strong enough to make her jumpy. "You think he'll escalate again?" she asked Whitmore as they stretched new wire. "Probably. The question is how far he's willing to go." "Far enough to hurt people?" Whitmore glanced at her, and she saw something in his expression that made her stomach clench. "I hope not, but I'm not taking any chances. From now on, nobody works alone, and everybody carries a radio." They finished the repairs as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pasture. The ride back to the barn was subdued, each of them lost in thoughts about what might come next. That evening, Marlena found herself reluctant to return to the bunkhouse. The building that had felt like a safe haven now seemed isolated and vulnerable. When Whitmore noticed her hesitation, he didn't say anything, but he made sure to walk her there personally. "Door has a good lock," he said, checking the mechanism. "And you've got my number if anything feels wrong. I'm probably being paranoid. Paranoid keeps you alive. Trust your instincts." That night, she lay awake listening to every sound outside. Her window. The normal ranch noises, cattle lowing, owls calling, the rustle of small animals in the brush, all seemed amplified and potentially threatening. Around midnight, she heard the sound of a truck engine in the distance. It could have been nothing, a neighbor driving home late, or someone using the county road that ran past the ranch. But something about the rhythm of the engine made her get up and look out the window. She couldn't see anything in the darkness, but the sound seemed to be circling the property rather than passing through. After 20 minutes, it faded away, leaving her wondering if she'd imagined the whole thing. The next morning brought new problems. Miguel arrived at dawn with word that someone had been tampering with the water system overnight. Main valve too. The south pasture was turned off, he reported. Cattle are without water. Accident? Whitmore asked hopefully. Valves locked in a concrete box. Takes a key to open it. Marlena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Cutting fences and stealing cattle was one thing, but interfering with water in the middle of summer could kill animals. How many head in that pasture? 150. If we don't get water flowing soon, we'll have to move them all. Moving that many cattle was a 2-day job under the best circumstances. In this heat, with the animals already stressed from lack of water, it would be dangerous for both livestock and handlers. Check the other water systems, Whitmore ordered. Make sure this isn't happening everywhere. As Miguel and Carlos spread out to inspect the ranch's water infrastructure, Marlena found herself alone with Whitmore for the first time since her accident. The easy companionship of the previous few days had been replaced by something harder and more urgent. "This is about more than water rights," she said. "Yeah, this is about driving me off my land entirely." "Why?" "Because Henderson wants the whole creek, not just access to it. My ranch controls the headwaters. If he owns this property, he controls water rights for the entire drainage." The scope of Henderson's ambition was staggering. He wasn't just stealing cattle or harassing a neighbor. He was systematically trying to destroy a way of life that had existed for generations. "What are you going to do?" "Whatever it takes to protect what's mine." There was something in his voice that made her look at him more closely. The easygoing rancher was gone, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. "Jack, my great-grandfather, bought this land in 1923. My grandfather expanded it during the Depression when other ranchers were going broke. My father spent 40 years building it into something worth passing down. I'll be damned if I'm going to let Bob Henderson take it away with threats and vandalism." The intensity of his emotion was almost frightening, but Marlena understood it. This wasn't just about property or money. It was about legacy and identity, about the difference between belonging somewhere and just existing. "You're not in this alone," she said quietly. He looked at her with surprise. "This isn't your fight. It is now. Henderson made it my fight when he started threatening the place I work and the people I—" She stopped, not ready to complete that thought. "The people." "You what?" "The people I care about," she said finally. The admission hung in the air between them, changing something fundamental in their relationship. They were no longer just employer and employee, or even friends. They were allies in a conflict that was escalating beyond anything either of them had anticipated. "Marlena," he said softly, "if this gets worse, I want you to consider leaving, finding work somewhere safer." "No, you don't understand what you're getting into." "I understand perfectly. And I'm not running away from another home." The word home slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw his expression change. "Is that what this is to you, home?" She thought about the question seriously, considering everything that had happened since she'd arrived at the Triple Star Ranch. The work, the people, The sense of purpose and belonging she'd been missing for years. "Yeah," she said finally, "I think it is." That afternoon, as they worked together to move cattle away from the compromised water system, Marlena found herself thinking about the choices that had brought her to this place. 3 months ago, she'd been a woman with no prospects and no place to belong. Now she was part of something worth fighting for. She just hoped they were strong enough to win. The emergency call came at 4 in the morning, jarring Marlena from the first deep sleep she'd managed in days. The phone's shrill ring cut through the pre-dawn silence like a knife, and she knew before answering that something was catastrophically wrong. "Marlena." Whitmore's voice was tight with controlled panic. "Get to the main barn. Now." She threw on clothes and ran the quarter-mile to the barn complex, her hip protesting this sudden exertion. Even before she reached the buildings, she could smell the acrid stench of smoke and see the orange glow, reflecting off the low-hanging clouds. The hay barn was completely engulfed in flames. Whitmore, Miguel, and Carlos were already there with the ranch's fire suppression equipment, but it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. The structure was old and dry, and the fire had too much of a head start. All they could do was prevent it from spreading to the other buildings. "When did it start?" Marlena shouted over the roar of the flames. "Miguel saw the glow around 3:30, Whitmore replied, not taking his eyes off the hose he was directing. "At the nearest barn wall. By the time we got here, it was already too late." Marlena grabbed a shovel and began digging a fire break around the equipment shed, her mind racing through the implications. That hay represented the ranch's winter feed supply. Months of careful planning and thousands of dollars worth of stored grass that would keep the cattle alive during the harsh season ahead. The volunteer fire department arrived 20 minutes later, their ancient truck struggling up the muddy access road. By then, the hay barn was a total loss, but the combined efforts had prevented the fire from spreading to the more critical buildings. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, the scope of the disaster became clear. Not only was the winter feed supply destroyed, but several pieces of expensive equipment that had been stored in the barn were also reduced to twisted metal and ash. Fire Chief Robert Garcia walked the perimeter with Whitmore, taking notes and photographs. Garcia was a lean man with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen his share of rural emergencies. "What's your assessment, Bobby?" Whitmore asked. Garcia pointed to what remained of the barn's electrical panel. "Could have been faulty wiring. This building's been here since the 70s, right? Old electrical systems can be unpredictable." "Could have been," Whitmore said carefully. "What else could have caused it?" "Accelerant, most likely. But I'd need the state fire investigator to confirm that, and he won't be available for a week or two." Marlena studied the burn pattern, noting how the fire seemed to have started in multiple locations simultaneously. Even with her limited knowledge of fires, it looked suspicious. "Chief Garcia," she said, "is it normal for electrical fires to start in several places at once?" Garcia followed her gaze, his expression growing more serious. "No, it's not. But, like I said, I'd need an expert opinion to say for certain." After the fire department left, the four of them stood among the ruins trying to process what had happened. The smell of burned hay and melted plastic hung heavy in the air, and Marlena could see the defeat beginning to settle over Whitmore's features. "How much hay was in there?" she asked. "About 60% of our winter supply," Miguel answered. "Maybe 400 tons. What will that cost to replace?" "Assuming we can find hay for sale in this drought?" Whitmore's laugh was bitter. 40. Maybe $50,000, if we're lucky." The number hit Marlena like a physical blow. She'd never dealt with ranching on this scale, where a single disaster could represent more money than most people made in a year. "Insurance?" Carlos asked hopefully. "We'll cover the building and some of the equipment. But hay is considered inventory, and the policy limits on that are pretty low." They spent the morning documenting the damage for the insurance company and trying to salvage anything useful from the wreckage. By noon, the heat had become unbearable, and the acrid smoke was making everyone's eyes water. "We need to talk about options," Whitmore said, as they gathered in the shade of the equipment shed. Marlena didn't like the tone of his voice. It was the sound of someone preparing to make difficult decisions, such as selling cattle early. "Cut the herd size so we don't need as much feed. That means selling at low prices," Miguel pointed out. "Markets always soft in the summer. Better than watching them starve come winter." Carlos kicked at the charred debris near his feet. "How many head would you have to sell?" "Maybe 300. Half the herd." The plan would essentially destroy the ranch as a viable operation. Rebuilding a cattle herd took years, and there was no guarantee the market would support that kind of long-term investment. "There has to be another way," Marlena said. "I'm open to suggestions." She didn't have any, at least not practical ones. Her grandfather's small operation had never faced this kind of catastrophic loss, and she was beginning to understand the crushing financial pressures that came with ranching at scale. That afternoon, as they worked to clear debris in the salvageable equipment, Marlena noticed a truck she didn't recognize parked near the ranch entrance. The driver stayed in the vehicle, apparently just watching their activities. "Jack," she said quietly, nodding toward the truck. He followed her gaze, and his expression hardened. "That's Henderson's foreman, Pete Tucker. Been sitting there for an hour. What's he doing?" "Making sure we know they're watching." The psychological warfare was almost worse than the physical damage. Henderson wasn't just trying to destroy the ranch. He was making sure they knew he was responsible while maintaining plausible deniability. As evening approached, Tucker finally drove away, but not before making a slow circuit of the ranch. Perimeter. The message was clear. They could strike anywhere, anytime, and there was nothing Whitmore could do to stop them. That night, Marlena found herself once again reluctant to return to the isolated bunkhouse. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, and every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. "Stay at the main house tonight," Whitmore said, apparently reading her thoughts. "The guest room's made up, and I'd feel better knowing you're not alone out there." This time she didn't argue. The events of the day had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, and the thought of lying awake listening for threats was exhausting. The guest room was simply furnished but comfortable, with windows that faced toward the barn complex. From her bed, she could see the blackened skeleton of the destroyed building silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Around midnight, she heard Whitmore moving around the house, checking locks and windows with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd done it before. The sounds should have been reassuring, but instead they emphasized how vulnerable they all felt. She was finally drifting off to sleep when she heard the sound that had become terrifyingly familiar. Truck engines in the distance, moving slowly around the ranch perimeter. This time, there were definitely multiple vehicles, and they seemed to be taking their time. A soft knock on her door brought her fully awake. "Marlena, you awake?" "Yeah." Whitmore cracked the door open, silhouetted against the hallway light. "Sounds like we've got company again." "How many?" 3 trucks, maybe 4. They've been circling for 20 minutes. She got up and pulled on her robe, joining him at the living room windows that faced the front of the property. In the distance, she could see headlights moving slowly along the county road that bordered the ranch. "What are they doing?" "Letting us know they can come and go as they please." Psychological pressure. "Are you going to call the sheriff?" "And tell him what? That truck are driving on public roads near my property?" The vehicles continued their slow patrol for another hour before finally disappearing into the night. But the message had been delivered. Henderson's people could strike again whenever they chose, and there was nothing law enforcement would or could do about it. The next morning brought a visitor that surprised everyone. Dr. Martinez arrived just after breakfast, carrying her medical bag and wearing an expression of professional concern. "Heard about the fire," she said. Thought I should check on everyone. Smoke inhalation can be serious, especially for people who've been fighting fires. She examined each of them in turn, pronouncing everyone healthy but recommending they watch for respiratory symptoms over the next few days. As she was packing her equipment, she pulled Whitmore aside for a private conversation. Marlena couldn't hear what they discussed, but she could see the doctor's serious expression and Whitmore's increasingly grim responses. When Dr. Martinez left, Whitmore seemed more troubled than before. "What was that about?" Marlena asked. "She's been treating some unusual injuries lately. Burns, cuts, wounds that don't match the explanations people are giving. She thinks someone's organizing a campaign of intimidation against multiple ranchers. How many others? At least 3 properties that she knows of. All of them have water rights Henderson wants." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just personal harassment. It was a systematic campaign to drive multiple families off their land. What are the other ranchers doing? According to Dr. Martinez, most of them are selling out, taking whatever Henderson offers rather than fighting. And you? Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the ruined hay barn. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe they're smarter than I am." The admission frightened Marlena more than all of Henderson's threats combined. Whitmore's determination to fight had been the one constant in this increasingly chaotic situation. If he was beginning to doubt himself, then Henderson might actually win that afternoon. While Miguel and Carlos worked on securing the remaining outbuildings, Marlena found herself alone with Whitmore in his office, going over insurance paperwork and trying to calculate their remaining options. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. Even with insurance money, replacing the hay would consume most of their operating capital. There would be nothing left for repairs, improvements, or the kind of contingency funds that every ranch needed to survive. "There is one option we haven't discussed," Whitmore said quietly. "What's that?" "Henderson made an offer 6 months ago. Before all this started. $3 million for the ranch and all water rights." Marlena felt her stomach drop. That's a lot of money. Enough to pay off the mortgage, cover all debts, and leave me with enough to start over somewhere else. And Henderson gets everything he wants. Henderson gets what he's going to take anyway if this keeps up. At least this way, I'd have something to show for it. The practicality of the argument was undeniable, but something in Marlena rebelled against the idea of surrender. This ranch represented more than just property or investment. It was home, heritage, and identity all rolled into one. "You'd really consider it?" "I'd be stupid not to consider it." They worked in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts about futures that neither of them had planned for. Finally, Whitmore closed the ledger and leaned back in his chair. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Depends on how personal." "If I sell this place, what happens to you? Where do you go?" The question hit her harder than she'd expected. Over the past month, she'd allowed herself to believe she'd found something permanent, a place where she could build a life rather than just survive from day to day. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Find another job, I guess. Another ranch somewhere. What if there was another option? Such as..." Whitmore opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box that looked old and well-handled. Marlena's heart began beating faster, though she wasn't sure why. "This belonged to my mother," he said, opening the box to reveal a delicate gold necklace with a small diamond pendant. "She always said it should go to someone who understood what this place meant." Marlena stared at the necklace, beautiful in its simplicity, but obviously valuable. The gold caught the afternoon light streaming through the office windows, and the diamond sparkled like captured starlight. "Jack, I can't." "Hear me out," he said quickly. "This isn't charity, and it's not some grand romantic gesture. It's a practical proposal between 2 people who understand each other." Her mouth went dry. "What kind of proposal?" "Marry me. Stay here and help me fight for this place. Together, we might be able to save it." The words hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. She looked at the necklace, then at his face, trying to read the emotions. Behind his carefully neutral expression, Jack ... I know it sounds crazy. We've known each other for a month, and most of that's been crisis management. But I also know you care about this place as much as I do. And I know I trust you more than anyone else in my life right now. The offer was tempting in ways she hadn't expected. Not just the security it represented, but the chance to truly belong. Somewhere. To fight for something worth saving alongside someone who understood the stakes. But it was also exactly the kind of help she'd spent years refusing to accept. Marlena stared at the necklace for what felt like an eternity, her mind racing through 1,000 different responses. The afternoon light streaming through the office windows made the diamond sparkle like fire, beautiful and tempting, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. I need some air, she said finally, standing abruptly and walking out of the office. She made it as far as the front porch before her legs gave out, and she sank onto the wooden steps with her head in her hands. Behind her, she could hear Whitmore following, but he had the wisdom not to say anything immediately. This isn't how it was supposed to happen, she said without looking up. How what was supposed to happen? Any of it. I was supposed to work here for a while, save some money, and figure out my next move. I wasn't supposed to. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Fall in love with the place? Fall in love, period. The admission hung between them like a confession, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. She hadn't meant to say it quite so directly, but there it was. Whitmore sat down beside her on the steps, careful to maintain some distance. Would that be such a terrible thing? Yes, no, I don't know. She finally looked at him, seeing her own confusion reflected in his eyes. Jack, I've spent the last 3 years learning to take care of myself. To not depend on anyone else for my survival or my happiness. And now you're asking me to ... to trust someone else. To let someone help carry the load. To accept charity. Is that what you think this is? She studied his face, looking for any sign of pity or condescension. Instead, she saw something that looked remarkably like hope, mixed with genuine affection. I don't know what this is, she said honestly. It's a partnership between two people who've both learned the hard way that life is easier with someone you can count on. And the necklace is a symbol. My mother always said that marriage should be based on choosing to build something together, not on need or desperation. Marlena thought about that, turning the words over in her mind. The distinction between need and choice was important, but the line between them seemed blurrier than she'd expected. What if Henderson wins anyway? What if we can't save the ranch even together? Then at least we'll have tried. And we'll figure out what comes next as a team. The practical part of her mind began calculating probabilities and outcomes. Marriage would give her legal standing to help make decisions about the ranch. It would also provide the kind of stability she'd been craving without admitting it to herself, but the wounded part of her psyche, the part that had learned to equate accepting help with losing independence, recoiled from the entire concept. I need time to think, she said. Of course. This isn't the kind of decision anyone should make quickly. How much time do we have before Henderson forces the issue? Whitmore was quiet for a moment, considering. Insurance adjuster comes tomorrow. We'll know more about our options after that. But realistically, maybe a week before I have to start making hard choices about selling cattle. A week to decide the course of her entire life. It seemed both too long and nowhere near enough time. Evening, Marlena found herself walking the perimeter of the ranch as the sun set, trying to sort through her tangled emotions. She deliberately avoided the main house after dinner, needing space to think without Whitmore's presence affecting her judgment. The landscape looked different in the golden light of evening, more beautiful but also more fragile. She could see why people fought for places like this, why they were willing to sacrifice comfort and security for the chance to belong somewhere, completely. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the sound of approaching vehicles. By the time she realized what she was hearing, it was too late to reach the safety of the buildings. 3 trucks emerged from the tree line, moving fast and converging on her position. For a moment, pure panic froze her in place. Then training kicked in, and she started running toward the nearest cover, a stock tank surrounded by mesquite trees. About 200 yards away, she almost made it. The lead truck cut her off, and she found herself facing Pete Tucker and 2 men she didn't recognize. All 3 were armed, and none of them looked interested in conversation. "Miss Davies," Tucker said with mock politeness, "Bob Henderson would like a word with you." "Tell Mr. Henderson I'm not interested in anything he has to say. I'm afraid that's not really an option." One of the other men moved to flank her, and Marlena realized she was trapped. Her radio was back at the bunkhouse, and she was too far from the main buildings for anyone to hear if she screamed. What does Henderson want? Just a friendly conversation about your future employment prospects. They forced her into the back of the lead truck, with Tucker driving, and the other 2 men ensuring she couldn't escape. As they drove away from the ranch, Marlena caught sight of Whitmore's house in the distance, and wondered if he'd notice. She was missing before it was too late. Henderson's ranch house was bigger and newer than Whitmore's, all stone and glass and architectural statements about wealth and power. They escorted her into a lavishly appointed office where Bob Henderson sat behind a massive oak desk, looking every inch the successful businessman. "Miss Davies," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "thank you for coming. I didn't exactly have a choice. Everyone has choices. That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you." He stood and walked to a window that overlooked his property, hands clasped behind his back in a pose that probably looked commanding, but struck Marlena as theatrical. "You're new to Texas," he continued, "so you might not understand how things work here. Sometimes neighbors have disagreements that need to be resolved creatively. You mean illegally? I mean practically. Jack Whitmore is sitting on resources that could benefit the entire community. Water rights that could support dozens of families instead of just one stubborn rancher. So you decided to terrorize him into selling." Henderson turned back to face her, his expression hardening slightly. "I decided to make him an offer he should have accepted. Unfortunately, Jack's always been too sentimental for his own good." "What does this have to do with me? You're an intelligent woman. You've seen the writing on the wall. The hay barn fire was just the beginning. Accidents are going to keep happening until Jack realizes he can't win this fight." Marlena felt her stomach clench. "You're threatening to hurt him." "I'm explaining reality. Jack's going to lose this ranch one way or another. The only question is whether he loses it with money in his pocket, or as a broken man with nothing. And you want me to convince him to sell. I want you to accept a better offer." Henderson returned to his desk and pulled out a folder, which he slid across to her. Inside were documents that made her eyes widen. A job offer with Henderson's operation that included a salary 3 times what Whitmore was paying her, plus benefits and a signing bonus that would cover her father's care for years. "This is conditional on Jack selling the ranch," she said after scanning the papers. "Of course. I need someone with your skills to manage the expanded operation. Someone who understands cattle and isn't afraid of hard work." The offer was genuinely attractive, more money than she'd ever dreamed of earning. It would solve all her financial problems and provide the kind of security she'd been seeking since her father's accident. All she had to do was betray the man who'd offered her his mother's necklace and help destroy the place she'd come to think of as home. "What if I refuse?" Henderson's smile became predatory. "Then you'll find yourself unemployed very soon anyway. And Jack might discover that accidents can happen to more than just buildings and livestock." The threat was barely veiled, and Marlena felt a chill run down her spine. These people weren't just willing to destroy property. They were prepared to hurt anyone who stood in their way. "I need time to consider your offer, of course." Take all the time you need. But remember, loyalty is an expensive luxury, and Jack Whitmore can't afford to pay your bills much longer." They drove her back to the ranch in silence, dropping her off near the main house without ceremony. As the trucks disappeared into the darkness, Marlena stood in the yard trying to process what had just happened. Whitmore emerged from the house before she'd taken 10 steps, his face tight with worry and anger. "Where the hell have you been? I've been looking everywhere for you. Henderson's people picked me up while I was walking. Wanted to have a conversation." His expression darkened. "What kind of conversation?" She told him about the job offer and the threats, watching his face grow harder with each detail. By the time she finished, he looked like a man preparing for war. "We're calling the sheriff," he said. "They didn't technically do anything illegal, just made threats and offered me a job. They kidnapped you. They gave me a ride. That's how they'll describe it, and it's my word against theirs." Whitmore ran his hands through his hair, frustration radiating from every line of his body. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Now they're targeting you directly. Because they think I have influence over your decisions. Do you?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications about their relationship and the proposal he'd made earlier. Marlena realized that her answer would determine not just her immediate future, but the direction of both their lives. "Maybe," she said finally, "if you wanted me to." Something shifted in his expression, hope mixing with determination. "Then help me figure out how to beat them." They spent the next hour in his office, going over financial projections and exploring every possible alternative to selling. The numbers were grim, but not impossible, if they could find a way to buy hay at reasonable prices and survive the winter. They might be able to rebuild. "There's one option we haven't fully explored," Whitmore said as they reviewed insurance estimates. "What's that?" "Partnership with another rancher. Someone who might benefit from sharing resources and splitting costs. Do you know anyone who might be interested?" "Maybe. Tom Bradley, the sheriff's brother, has been talking about expanding his operation. And there's Sarah Chun up near Amarillo, who's been looking for grazing leases." The idea had merit, but it would require time to negotiate and implement. Time they might not have if Henderson escalated his campaign further. "That still doesn't solve the immediate problem," Marlena pointed out. "Henderson's not going to stop because we find a business partner." "No, but it makes us harder to intimidate. Harder to isolate." As they talked, Marlena found herself studying Whitmore's face, noting the lines of stress and exhaustion that had deepened over the past few weeks. He was carrying an enormous burden, and her decision about his proposal would either lighten that load or force him to bear it alone. "Jack," she said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Anything." "If Henderson wasn't threatening us, if the ranch was secure and profitable, would you still want to marry me?" The question seemed to surprise him, but he answered without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely. Why?" "Because you understand this place. The way I do. Because you're not afraid of hard work or uncertain futures. Because when I watch you with the horses or working cattle, I see someone who belongs here. And because somewhere between your first day and now, I fell in love with you. Not because I need you to save the ranch, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." The simple honesty of his answer hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the practical aspects of his proposal that she'd almost missed the emotional foundation beneath it. "The necklace," she said quietly. "Tell me about your mother." Whitmore smiled for the first time in days. "She was the strongest person I ever knew. Raised me mostly by herself while my father was working cattle or dealing with drought or market crashes. She never complained, never acted like she was sacrificing anything for our family. What would she think about all this? She'd tell me to fight for what matters and not to let fear make my decisions for me. And about us, she'd like you. She always said the best partnerships were between people who chose each other as equals, not because they needed rescuing." Marlena thought about that, about the difference between choosing someone and needing them. For the first time since Whitmore had opened that velvet box, the distinction seemed clear. "Can I see the necklace again?" He retrieved it from his office, and this time when he opened the box, she looked at it with different eyes. It was still beautiful, still valuable, but more importantly, it was a symbol of choosing to build something together rather than accepting charity from someone who pitied her situation. "If I said yes," she said carefully, "it wouldn't be because I need rescuing. I know. And it wouldn't be because I think it's my only option. I know that too. It would be because I want to fight for this place, with you, as your partner in every sense of the word. Is that a yes?" Marlena looked around the office, seeing it now not just as Whitmore's workspace, but as the nerve center of something she wanted to help protect and build. She thought about Henderson's threats and his job offer, about the choice between security and belonging, between safety and home. "Ask me again," she said. Whitmore stood and walked around the desk, taking the necklace from its box. In the lamplight, the gold seemed to glow with warmth, and the diamond caught and reflected the hope in his eyes. "Marlena Davies," he said formally, "will you marry me? Will you stay here and help me fight for our future together?" This time, her answer came without hesitation. Yes. As he fastened the necklace around her throat, Marlena felt something fundamental shift inside her. For the first time in years, accepting help didn't feel like defeat. It felt like coming home. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and hot, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made everything seem possible. Marlena woke in the guest room for the last time, her fingers unconsciously reaching for the necklace. That had become a constant presence around her throat over the past week. They decided on a simple ceremony at the courthouse in town, with Miguel and Carlos as witnesses. Nothing elaborate or expensive. They were saving every penny for the fight ahead. But as Marlena looked at herself in the mirror, wearing her best blouse and the gold necklace that caught the morning light, she felt more beautiful than she ever had in her life. The courthouse ceremony was brief but meaningful, conducted by Judge Patricia Wells, who'd known Whitmore since he was a child. When Jack slipped the simple gold band onto Marlena's finger, another piece of his mother's jewelry, she felt the last of her reservations fall away. "You may kiss the bride," Judge Wells announced with a smile. The kiss was gentle, full of promise rather than passion, and when they broke apart, Marlena saw her own hopes reflected in her new husband's eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly. "Mrs. Whitmore," she repeated, testing the sound of her new name. Miguel embraced them both with tears in his eyes, while Carlos took pictures with an old camera that had belonged to his grandfather. The whole ceremony had taken less than 20 minutes, but Marlena knew she would remember every detail for the rest of her life. They were walking back to the truck when Sheriff Bradley approached, his expression grim. "Jack, I need to talk to you. Can it wait, Tom? We're kind of having a moment here." "I'm afraid not. Got a call about an hour ago. Someone cut your cattle loose from the south pasture." "All of them." The celebration evaporated instantly. 200 head of cattle scattered across the countryside represented a disaster that could take days to resolve and cost thousands in damaged crops as the animals wandered onto neighboring properties. "When?" Whitmore asked, already moving toward the truck, sometime between midnight and dawn. Miguel's dad spotted them on the highway around 6 this morning. Marlena felt a familiar surge of anger. Henderson couldn't even let them have their wedding day without interference. Any evidence of who did it. Bradley's expression became uncomfortable. Tire tracks that match vehicles registered to Henderson Ranch. "But Jack, unless you actually saw his people cutting the fence, I can't arrest anyone. Even with his history of harassment, history isn't evidence. And Bob Henderson's got friends in high places who don't appreciate being accused without proof." As they drove back to the ranch, Marlena could see Whitmore's jaw tightening with each mile. Their wedding day had been ruined, and worse, they were facing another expensive disaster when they could least afford it. "We'll get them back," she said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. Some of them maybe. But cattle scattered like that. We'll lose at least 10% to accidents, theft, or just plain disappearing. The ranch yard was in chaos when they arrived. Miguel and his extended family had mobilized to help, along with several neighbors who'd heard about the situation. Even Dr. Martinez was there, having closed her clinic for the day to join the search effort. Any word on how many we've found? Whitmore asked Miguel. Maybe 60 heads so far. The rest are scattered from here to the county line. Carlos rode up on his horse, dusty and sweating from hours in the saddle. Found another 20 near Miller's Creek. But there's a problem. Henderson's got his people out there too, claiming any cattle that cross onto his land. He can't do that, Marlena said. He can if we can't prove ownership fast enough, Miguel replied grimly. A lot of these cattle don't have current brands, and ear tags can be ... misplaced. The implication was clear. Henderson wasn't just trying to cost them money through scattered cattle. He was planning to steal as many as he could in the confusion. That's it, Whitmore said, heading for the barn. I'm done playing defense. Marlena caught up with him as he was saddling his horse with swift, angry movements. Jack, what are you planning? I'm going to Henderson's place. This ends today. That's exactly what he wants. He's trying to provoke you into doing something stupid. Maybe stupid is what the situation calls for. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. We just got married 30 minutes ago. I'm not losing my husband to Bob Henderson's games on our wedding day. Then what do you suggest? Marlena thought quickly, her mind racing through possibilities. Henderson was counting on them reacting emotionally, making mistakes that would give him legal advantages, but there might be another way. We document everything. Take pictures, gather witnesses, build a case that even Sheriff Bradley can't ignore. That takes time we don't have. Then we split up. You coordinate the cattle roundup, I'll handle the evidence gathering. But we do this smart. Not angry. Whitmore studied her face, and she could see him forcing himself to think past his immediate fury. You sure about this? I'm sure about us. About fighting together instead of letting Henderson tear us apart. The next several hours passed in a blur of coordinated activity. Marlena drove the perimeter roads with a camera, documenting every piece of cut fence, every tire track, every sign of deliberate sabotage. Meanwhile, Whitmore led the mounted search effort, working with neighbors and volunteers to locate and recover scattered cattle. By afternoon, they'd found most of the missing animals, though several had been injured in their panicked flight and would require veterinary care. More troubling, nearly 30 heads were still unaccounted for, and witnesses reported seeing Henderson's trucks herding cattle toward his property. We need to confront him, Miguel said as they regrouped near the barn, but carefully. Not we, Whitmore corrected. Me and Marlena. This is our fight. They rode to Henderson's ranch as the sun was setting, exhausted but determined. The evidence Marlena had gathered was compelling, clear photos of cut fences, tire tracks that matched Henderson's vehicles, and witness statements from neighbors who'd seen his men herding cattle. Henderson was waiting for them on his front porch, flanked by Pete Tucker and 2 other men. His smile was as cold and empty as ever. Well, the newlyweds. Congratulations on your marriage, though I'm surprised you took time for romance with all these missing cattle to worry about. Cut the act, Bob, Whitmore said. We know you scattered our herd, and we know you've got some of our cattle penned up here. That's a serious accusation. I hope you have proof. Marlena pulled out the camera and started showing him pictures. Tire tracks from your vehicles at multiple fence-cutting locations. Witnesses who saw your men herding cattle toward your property. Time-stamped photos showing the sequence of events. Henderson's smile faltered slightly. Circumstantial at best. Maybe. But it's enough to get the state agricultural inspector involved. And I'm betting he'll be very interested in checking brands and ownership records for all the cattle currently on your property. For the first time since they'd known him, Henderson looked genuinely concerned. A state inspection would reveal any irregularities in his livestock records, including cattle that might have been acquired through questionable means. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Our cattle are back. All of them, and an end to the harassment. And if I refuse? Then we file charges, request the inspection, and let the authorities sort it out." Of course, that kind of investigation tends to look at everything: tax records, water rights documentation, business licenses. Might turn up all sorts of interesting information. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, clearly calculating his options. Finally, he nodded to Tucker. "Pete, take them to the holding pen. Return any cattle that belong to the Triple Star." The pen behind Henderson's barn contained exactly 28 head of Whitmore's cattle, all with hastily altered ear tags that had been crudely replaced. It was clear evidence of theft, and Henderson knew they knew it. "Mistakes happen," Henderson said as they loaded the cattle into trailers. "Confusion during roundups and such." "Mistakes," Whitmore agreed. "But they won't happen again, will they? Not if everyone minds their own business." As they drove the recovered cattle back to the Triple Star Ranch, Marlena felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of winning a fight through intelligence rather than surrender. "Think it's over?" she asked. "This round is, but men like Henderson don't give up easily. Then we'll be ready for the next round." 2 weeks later, they received an unexpected visitor. A man in expensive suit introduced himself as David Chun, a lawyer from Austin representing a consortium of investors interested in purchasing water rights throughout the region. "We've been monitoring the situation with Mr. Henderson," Chun explained as they sat in the ranch house living room. "His methods are questionable. We'd prefer to work with landowners who are interested in fair partnerships rather than hostile takeovers." The offer he presented was attractive: a long-term lease arrangement that would provide steady income while allowing them to maintain ownership of the ranch. More importantly, it would give them the financial stability to resist future pressure from Henderson. "Why us?" Marlena asked. "Because you fought back. Henderson's been using intimidation tactics against multiple ranchers in this area, but you're the first to successfully stand up to him. That tells us you're the kind of people we want as partners." That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marlena reflected on how much had changed since she'd first driven up this dusty road with $17 in her pocket. "Any regrets?" Whitmore asked, following her gaze across the pastures where their cattle grazed peacefully. "About what?" "Accepting charity from a strange rancher who offered you his mother's necklace." She touched the necklace, which had become so much a part of her that she sometimes forgot she was wearing it. "It wasn't charity," she said firmly. "It was the smartest investment I ever made." "How do you figure?" "I invested my pride and independence in a partnership that gave me everything I didn't know I was looking for: a home, a purpose, and someone who sees me as an equal. And I got a wife who's too stubborn to quit and too smart to let me make stupid mistakes. Sounds like a fair trade." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marlena thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd left Oklahoma as a woman with nothing to lose, determined never to accept help from anyone. Now she was Mrs. Jack Whitmore, co-owner of a successful ranch, planning a future she'd never dared to imagine. "Jack? Your mother was right about the necklace." "How so?" "It did go to someone who understood what this place meant. Someone who was ready to fight for it." "Think she would have approved?" Marlena smiled, remembering the woman she'd never met, but whose presence seemed to linger in every corner of the ranch. "I think she would have said that the best partnerships are built on choosing each other as equals, not on need or desperation." "That sounds like something she would say." "Then yes, I think she would have approved." 6 months later, as Marlena watched the sunrise from the same porch where she'd first refused Whitmore's offer of chili, she marveled at how much her life had changed. The water rights partnership was thriving. Henderson had moved his operations to another county, And the Triple Star Ranch was more prosperous than it had been in years. But more than that, she'd learned the difference between charity and love. Between dependence and partnership. Between accepting help because you had no choice and choosing to build something together because you wanted to. The necklace caught the morning light as she turned to go inside and start breakfast for her husband. And the ranch hands who'd become family. She'd told Henderson she didn't need charity, and she'd been right. What she'd needed was something far more valuable, a place to belong, and someone who understood that the strongest partnerships were built between equals who chose to face the world together. And that, she thought with a smile, was exactly what she'd found. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.